Hello, my name's Jeff Messier. I'm a professor in electrical and software engineering in the Schulich School of Engineering. And this is a little bit of a tutorial video that is meant to accompany my presentation at the 2024 Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference. And so the title of my presentation at the conference is Spreadsheets versus AI, and the purpose of the presentation is to give an example of how sometimes using a simple tool like a spreadsheet can give you performance that's kind of comparable to using machine learning. And I do also have a YouTube video of my full presentation for the conference, and the link to that presentation is just in the notes area of this YouTube video. You can find the link there. But the purpose of this particular video is to just kind of show you how to build the spreadsheet that implements the ideas that I talk about in my bigger presentation. And so to get started, what do you need to know to sort of go through this tutorial? Well, I'm going to start off by assuming you have a basic knowledge of how to use Microsoft Excel. And so by that, I mean, you know how to, enter in dates, you know how to do sort of column operations. You can add up a column of numbers, you know how to copy things back and forth, and you can do sort of like basic operations like figure out the maximum of a column of numbers. And if you're brand new to Excel, this tutorial is going to maybe start a little bit ahead of that. So I'm going to assume that you've got some basic knowledge of Excel. And if you don't, there's lots of tutorials out there. However, on this slide, I do have two QR codes that are linked to two specific Excel tutorials on YouTube that deal with using logic functions. So by logic functions, I mean AND functions and OR functions, as well as using logic functions to sort of govern how we operate on columns of numbers. And so this is a little bit more advanced if you're just kind of a regular spreadsheet user. So if you've never used logic functions or if functions inside Excel, what I would recommend is you stop the video now, go through these both of these tutorials. They're pretty good, sort of very methodical tutorials, and that will give you the background necessary to understand what we're going to talk about next. Also, in this tutorial, I am going to be creating a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet does not contain real data from people accessing emergency homelessness shelter services. So the data is completely synthetic, it's completely fake. And this QR code is to download the finished spreadsheet. So this is the spreadsheet that we're going to build during this tutorial. So if you like, this is the answer. So you can look at it and you'll see the completed spreadsheet. But what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go through all the steps that I use to create that spreadsheet, and I'll talk about each of the operations that I implement. Okay, so I want to start by looking at the sort of the raw data. And this tab is called Sleep Data. So I'm going to assume that this is just entries recording when people have accessed an emergency shelter to sleep there for the night. We have only two columns in our data. The first one is a client ID number. And the second column is the date when that person slept in shelter. So the person with client ID number 1 slept in shelter on February 3rd and slept again in shelter on February 4th, again on February 5th, and so on. And you can see the data is grouped by evening. So here are the two clients that slept in shelter on February 3rd. Here's the one client that slept in shelter on February 4th, and so on. And so I'm going to assume that this is sort of like the raw data format that most shelters might use. Now, on this summary tab, tab, this is where we're going to kind of do our work, right? This is where we're going to implement the ideas that I talked about in the presentation. And so if you're watching this video and you have not seen my full CAEH presentation, what I recommend is that you stop here, take a look at the presentation, because in that presentation, I kind of set the stage. You know, I talk about a lot of the big concepts, our objective, what we're using this spreadsheet for, and some of the big ideas that we're trying to implement in this spreadsheet. So I'm going to just refer to those ideas now. I'm going to assume you've watched the presentation either in person or on YouTube. And we've got, and I'm going to start adding things to the spreadsheet. The first thing we want on this summary spreadsheet is just a list of all the people who have accessed our shelter services. And so I'm going to create a client ID column. And I'm going to use the function unique. And I'm going to click over onto sleep data. And I'm just going to apply the unique function to all of the client ID entries that we have, right? And so what this function does is it takes a look at a bunch of entries, you know, some of them might contain repeats, and then just gives us all of the unique values in that big list. And so we can see here, change my formatting. We can see here that we have had 5 people use our shelter. And if we go back to our sleep data, we can see that, you know, if we look through this big list, we can see basically 5 unique client ID numbers. And but some of them repeat, they're not all in the same order. And so the unique function just gives us this nice formatted list of all the individual people. Now, one of the pieces of information that's going to be really useful for us is when did each of these clients first access shelter and when did they last access shelter? And to figure this out, we're going to use the max ifs function and the min ifs function. Now, if you've gone through the tutorial material that I gave the QR codes for, the second tutorial talks about the sum ifs function. And so these are just versions, different variations on the sum ifs function. And I'll show how this works. So first heat shelter. Okay, so I'll call these two columns first date in shelter and last date in shelter. I'm going to format them so they look a little bit nicer here. Wrap text. Yeah, center. There we go. So the first date in shelter is the lowest date. So we can use the minimum function. So min ifs. And what I like about Excel is that it gives you this little sort of almost help menu, right? So I type in the min ifs function, and again, this is very similar to the sum ifs function that in the tutorial I gave the link to. The first thing you want to do is highlight the list of numbers that you want to take the minimum of. And so if we go to our sleep data, it's all of these dates. Now, for each one of the entries in this row, we want to give the results for each of the individual clients. So in the first row, we want to give the minimum for client number 1. In the second row, we want to give the minimum for client number 2, and so on. And so if we go back here, our criteria range will be client ID, right? So we want to take the minimum of a number depending on what our client ID is. And then the last cell, the criteria that we're equal to is the desired client ID number. And so if I hit enter, what this formula does is give us the earliest date in shelter for client ID number 1. And if you check on the data, we can just double check that the first date for client number 1 in shelter is in fact February 3rd. So it seems to work. Now, if we want to do the same calculation for client number 2, the cool thing in Excel is we can just copy the cell down. But if you take a look at what happens when you just copy a formula down in Excel, the values in the formula change, right? So up here, we check on sleep data from cell B2 to B20. That changes to B3 to B21 down here. And we actually don't want that to happen because that means we're going to miss the first entry in our sleep data. And so the way to avoid the way to keep cells from changing when you copy is to put the number sign in front of each one of these. Well, actually, I guess if we want the numbers to not change, we just need to put them in front of the numbers. So I'm going to put the number here and the number here. I'm actually not going to put the number sign in this last one because this we actually do want to change, because when I copy it down, we want to get the minimum for client number 2, which is in A7. And so if I keep copying down, we're now going to get the first day in shelter for each one of our 5 clients. And again, you can sort of go to the sleep data, manually check to make sure that this worked. For the last day in shelter, I'm going to basically do the same thing, but rather than getting the minimum date for a particular person, I'm going to select the maximum date for a particular person. And so I'm going to use the maxIfs function that otherwise works exactly the same as the minimum. So we want to take the maximum of our date values. We want to filter based on client ID. And for my first formula, I want to look for client ID number 1. And this is the last day in shelter for client number 1. And I'm just going to add my dollar signs like I did before. And copy down. And this is the last day in shelter for each one of the clients. So we know the first day somebody showed up in shelter, and we also know the last day they used shelter services. Okay, so now we're ready to start building our spreadsheet a little bit more towards our ultimate objective, which is to spot people who are at risk of becoming long-term shelter users. And the whole reason why we want to spot these people is we want to reach out and offer them supports perhaps sooner rather than later. But we also don't want to be looking for people who have long ago stopped using our shelter. And so most shelters will have, fairly long historical records, including a bunch of people who are no longer visiting our shelter. And so we only want to look at people who are still kind of hanging around. And so a useful thing to be able to calculate is the number of days since we last saw a person in our shelter, or the number of days since they've last accessed shelter. And so days since last access can be calculated using the date diff function, the date difference function. Now, in this tutorial, I am using a bunch of different functions. And you know what? If I use something like the date diff function and you're like, wow, I've never heard of that one before, by all means, stop the video and Google it. So all of these functions that I'm using have excellent sort of kind of tutorials or manual pages or help pages on the internet. And so if I'm like blasting up something here, you're like, oh, I've never heard of date diff before. Pause the video. Just, you can stop me from talking and Google the function, satisfy yourself that you understand what it does, and then start the video again, right? This is the great thing about teaching over video. I think you can go absolutely at your own pace. And so the purpose of the date diff function is to figure out how many days have elapsed between two dates. And so we want to figure out how many days elapsed between our last time we saw the person in shelter and today's date, and I want to express my answer in terms of number of days. And so we saw this person, client number 1, 2 days ago, and we can check to make sure that this is right. So the days since the person was last in shelter, February 10th, today's date is February 12th, and that was 2 days ago. So again, I want to today's date is a fixed value in B1, so I'm just going to put a $sign there, so that doesn't change when I copy this down. And then when I do copy it down, we can see that we've got 1 day since we saw the 2 people who accessed the shelter on the 11th, 6 days since we saw the person who accessed the shelter on the 6th, and this person accessed the shelter on the 10th. So we can check with our manual data and we can verify that this is working okay. So the next thing we want to calculate, and we're going to do this in 2 steps, is the percentage of time a person has spent in shelter, because we sort of proposed in the presentation part of this exercise that somebody who is spending a lot of their time in shelter, or somebody who has a high percentage, or who is spending a high percentage of their time in shelter, might be at increased risk of becoming a long-term shelter user. And so, the number of days since somebody first appeared in shelter is going to be kind of an input to this calculation. And we'll call this shelter access duration, I guess. There's a few different terms we could use for this, I suppose. But basically, and we're going to use the date diff function again. It's the number of days since between when somebody first accessed shelter and today, expressed in terms of days. And so there's been 9 days since the person first accessed shelter and today. And then if I just copy this, put in the $sign, the shelter access duration is populated accordingly. And again, you can sort of just manually check these dates to make sure that they make sense. Okay, so now we're ready for our main event. So in the presentation, we proposed the idea that somebody who is spending a lot of time in shelter is at risk of becoming a long-term shelter user. And so what we want to do is we want to calculate the percentage of time somebody is spending in shelter, with the idea that people with high percentages might be at elevated risk. And so for client 1, for example, we've had 9 days elapse since client number 1 first showed up in shelter. And we want to calculate the percentage of those days client number 1 actually spent sleeping in shelter. And so if we look at our sleep data, we can just count the number of times we see client number 1, right? So we've got client 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in the data. And so we could calculate this by hand, and we could say the percentage is 100 times 5 days, 5 stays divided by 9 days. And so the person is in shelter 55.6% of the time. We can then propose a threshold for, where we kind of identify people at elevated risk. In the presentation, I choose kind of arbitrarily a threshold of 50%. And so client number 1 is above 50%, and we would say that this means client number 1 is at elevated risk. However, we don't want to do this calculation manually. We want the spreadsheet to do the work for us. And so rather than manually counting the number of times client number 1 shows up in the data, I want to do that automatically. And I'm going to use the count ifs function. And the count ifs function is kind of like max ifs, min ifs, except that we only have 2 arguments for it. We have the criteria range, which is the list of client IDs. And then we just give the function the specific ID that we're looking for, in our case, client number 1. And sure enough, we get the number 5, right? So this function says this person has showed up 5 times in the data. And if I put my number signs here, the function says that client number 2 shows up 7 times, client number 3 shows up 3 times, 2 times, 1 time. And you can just, because we're using such a small amount of data for this example, you can go and double check to make sure that this is right. But we're not quite there, right? We want just not the total number of times, we want the shelter access percentage. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this value by the person's shelter access duration, and then we get a fraction. And so I'm just going to copy this down, and then I'm going to express this as a percentage. And this is our shelter access percentage. So we have client number 1 with 56%, client number 2 with fairly high 78%. 57%, and so on. Okay, so it seems like we're there, but there's still a few more things that we need to add to this spreadsheet. So in the presentation, we talked about, the fact that it's important to, at least allow somebody to accumulate a little bit of time in shelter so we can have kind of a stable idea of, whether or not they're using shelter consistently or not, right? So we don't want to assess somebody after just 3 days of shelter use because, quite often somebody will use shelter for a very short period of time and then exit shelter without help on their own, right? So we want to have somebody accumulate enough days that we know that they're still kind of hanging around, but we don't want them to have to accumulate so many days that they need to become a long-term shelter resident before we see if they're at risk of becoming a long-term shelter resident. And so this kind of magical window is a little bit arbitrary, but we chose it to be 90 days in the presentation. 90 days doesn't really work with our example data just because we're using such small numbers here. So I'm going to set this evaluation time at 4 days, but I'm just going to make a note. This corresponds to the 90-day window in the main presentation. And so basically we want to only evaluate people that have a shelter access duration of at least 4 days. And so, we can have an evaluate column, and this is just going to be equal to true or false whether or not our duration is greater than or equal to our evaluation time. In this case, it's true, right? 9 days is greater than 4 days. And so that we should have a look at this person based on their duration. I'm going to put the number sign in here. And so everybody on the list has been in shelter for at least 4 days, except for client number 5. Client number 5 has only been in shelter for 2 days, and so we hasn't yet met the evaluate criteria. The other thing we talked about is whether a person is still around, right? So we only want to sort of look at people who are still using shelter, because our data might be, have a lot of historical clients that have long since moved on and are no longer using our services. And so we can set a little threshold here as well. We can say we only want to look at people who have been in shelter, let's say, in the last 3 weeks. So in the presentation, we choose 21 days or 3 weeks as our sort of active client threshold. Again, here, we're going to, 21 days won't work with this data. So I'm going to just use 2 days. And so we say somebody is still around if the days since they've last accessed shelter is are less than or equal to sort of our active threshold. So it's true in this case, and true for everybody, except for client number 4. Client number 4 we haven't seen for 6 days, and so we're not really sure if they're still around. And so now we are ready to do our final indication of whether somebody is at risk. So someone is at risk if their shelter access percentage is greater than our at-risk threshold, and they have accumulated at least 4 days in shelter, which is this column, and they're still using our shelter services. So, whoops. Yikes. Our final at-risk column, you'll notice when I was sort of laying out all of those conditions, I kept on using the word and. And so we're going to use the AND function in Excel to do our final at-risk indication. So somebody is at risk if their shelter access percentage is greater than or equal to our threshold, and they've accumulated at least 4 days in shelter, and they're still around. So when we combine all those conditions together, we see that client number 1 would meet our criteria for being at risk. And if we copy down our criteria, we can see that client number 2 definitely at risk, right? Because has accumulated the required number of days, is still around, and is using shelter 78% of the time, which is quite a lot. Client number 3, kind of like client number 1. Client number 4, however, is not considered at risk. Not only has client number 4 a relatively low shelter access percentage, we haven't seen client number 4 for a while. And so we wouldn't be looking for them as a person who, might need to be connected with extra supports. And then finally, client number 5 meets our 50% cutoff, is still around, but just hasn't quite been in shelter long enough, right? Only 2 days, and we'd like to see at least 4 days of shelter access before we can say for sure that this is a stable shelter access pattern. And so that's it. That's the whole tutorial. Now, if you're kind of watching the presentation video at the same time, you've maybe taken a break from the presentation and you've gone through this tutorial. Now you can go back to the presentation and see how well our spreadsheet does. It actually doesn't do too badly. But again, the whole purpose, the whole motivation for this tutorial, this presentation, is to really try and empower you to start working with your data. A lot of people sort of look down on spreadsheets a little bit and they're like, oh, we're just using Excel. But in many cases, Excel is a really powerful tool that can really give you some insight into your data. So don't feel bad or bashful about using Excel. Use it as your first go-to tool. It's cheap. You probably have people in your organization who are really good at using it already. And only go to something more sophisticated if Excel can't answer your questions. But in this particular example, as you're going to see in the main presentation, it actually doesn't do too badly.